This episode of Art Block is brought to you by the supporters of my Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, the link to my page is in the description below. Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host Spirit, and today we'll be covering the topic of tracing and whether it's a bad habit or a necessary tool for developing artists. Now, admittedly I've covered the topic of artistic ethics quite a lot on my channel. Heck, back in the old days of 2015 when I was trapped in the land of Pony, I actually discussed art theft and more specifically profiting off of other works. There's a lot to be discussed about, and depending on the stage that you're in your creative journey, you can either be on the giving or receiving end of this kind of topic. The biggest inspiration for me talking about this is, unsurprisingly, my copying versus referencing video. One of my most controversial and vitriolic when it comes to the comments section. I believe a lot of people may have misconstrued what I meant with that video, and though in hindsight that video would have been worded better, I think it ultimately could be better to discuss it now, as tracing is a rather important topic when it comes to improving your artistic skills. So first and foremost, I feel it is best to establish the two sides of this argument. The first one is the more positive of the two, essentially saying that tracing is an alright form of learning as long as credit is given and you don't claim it solely as your own. The second one is, I suppose, the more negative, saying you shouldn't trace as it doesn't help you to learn how to draw on your own and learn basic fundamentals. Now, obviously both sides of the argument have their own merit, and while I will try to do my best to reach a happy medium, ultimately everything is going to be subjective based off of people's background and relative education in art. Let's start off with the more positive side of tracing, since I have a feeling a lot of people will just go straight to the comments without actually watching through the other half of the argument. So, what are some of the positives of using tracing as a learning method? Well, one of the biggest supporting arguments of this stance is it allows you to gain better control over your hand and gain some level of coordination and technique. This, I feel, is a good point, as when one is starting off in the earlier stages of drawing, it can seem rather awkward to sort of draw blindly, as we'll call it. Especially for those earlier off in their development cycle, drawing and using techniques can be rather difficult to learn for those who are metaphorically being thrown into the deep end. Another argument I've found when it comes to the positives of tracing is that it helps you learn anatomy. This point is something I'm personally a bit more on the fence about, and to explain it I'd like to use an example. As of late, I've been working on a lot more human-oriented stories, both in written and visual form. Until about a year ago, I had absolutely horrid drawing skills when it came to humans and bipedal creatures in general. Now, up until then, I had managed to sort of pull them off with heavily referencing and sometimes taking pictures of myself and tracing over them. Given my image is essentially my intellectual property, I saw nothing wrong with it. I probably would have continued doing this, however tracing over one person can not only limit me in what I draw, but it doesn't really push me to improve and grow as an artist. I suppose that if there is a sort of happy medium to this argument is that you can learn quite a bit by applying construction lines and drawing the underlying structures of whatever it is you're trying to learn. Now of course I wouldn't encourage you to do this forever, however if you want to learn how to build the general structure by tracing over other pictures in your earlier days, it might actually help you in the long run. Another thing this can actually be really helpful in is learning the intricacies of difficult aspects of art, such as hands, noses, eyes, etc. Hands and feet generally have certain techniques that help their construction appear more natural and shapely. However, I would encourage you to do studies and try to build up from the ground up rather than tracing. Now, let's discuss the negative aspects of tracing for developing artists. The biggest one that comes to the forefront is it's rather inhibiting to those who are trying to learn form and anatomy. Yes, you can come to understand certain aspects of anatomy by tracing over, say, a human torso. However, I personally found that I tend to retain details and information about anatomy a lot better if I am drawing them by hand and simply referencing the picture I'm drawing. Quite often you will hear the term drawing from life, and the reason why this technique tends to work so well is because it challenges you to be really observant and think about what you're drawing. Now, of course this can be rather difficult for artists in their early development stages. Thinking back to my first year or two of art, I often found myself resorting back to the same few structures and animals, being stylistic dragons and ponies. Though it is something you will have to ease into, I would recommend that you use tracing for, at most, the first year of your learning experience. Another thing I should mention is the relative ethics of tracing, primarily in the online environment. I think when I discussed it in copying versus referencing, I didn't really emphasize the fact that the segment on tracing was more meant for the online environment rather than in the learning environment. Ultimately, what you do to learn is up to you. However, in terms of posting artwork and hosting an online gallery, the tides sort of shift in another direction. Now, this field is sort of subjective to each and every individual person. Some may be completely fine with tracing and posting while others don't feel it should be deserving of any attention. Personally, if I'm going to choose a perspective, I would say that you should not post artwork that has a majority of it traced. I'll say at least 50% or more as a general margin. Admittedly, this comes from a more personal aspect, but I feel it is important to understand why, as it makes me somewhat biased on this particular topic. I have seen a few cases where people will trace my character poses as well as the bases and original drawings to create fan art, so to speak. Now, initially I was okay with it. After all, it was just harmless fan art and all that. But then I found out that one particular artist had basically traced everyone else's hard work that was in the picture instead of making their own work and was essentially profiting off of it. Ultimately, this is the reason why I personally wouldn't condone posting any sort of traced artwork, because any recognition or praise you get for it would not be entirely yours to earn. Now, the main rebuttal to this would be that you can obviously give credit in your descriptions, and maybe even get permission to trace the artwork. Now, in cases where the artist has given you explicit permission to trace their work, there isn't much else to say other than it's their choice. However, just giving credit without getting permission to trace over it is where I would draw the line. If you plan on tracing someone's work without their permission, don't post it. Alright, so now that we've discussed the positive and negative aspects of tracing, I want to wrap this up with both a general conclusion and some final words regarding the original video. Ultimately, when it comes to tracing, what you do in your home by yourself has no effect on me. I can't stop people from tracing, nor would I throw a huge "it's bad and you shouldn't do it" blanket over top. As a learning tool, I do believe that tracing has some value to it for earlier artists. However, I would not encourage using it maybe past your first or second year of working with art. My general rule of thumb is that if you can't draw something yourself, but you want to draw it, try drawing it anyways by using reference materials instead of tracing. Ultimately, I think that drawing from life and doing studies will get you a lot further in the long run. From personal experience, anatomy studies have been one of the biggest helps in years when it comes to making artwork. Finally, I want to make some addendums and general apologies for how my previous video on the topic may have been confusing or possibly given some people a wrong impression. Though I do feel you should not use tracing as a means of learning how to draw, it does have its benefits and place in the artistic community. For example, extreme realism or creating direct duplicates of photographs or other pictures can be incredibly difficult to do by hand. I actually remember back to my first year or so of schooling when we were doing art projects, and we would trace our portraits in order to get more practice on forms and other forms of execution such as shading. Though I do feel that tracing can only take you so far in your illustrative skills, there are certain benefits to using it when the actual illustration part isn't the main focus. Using the method to expedite the process to get to a final piece, or ensure that the piece is as exact to its original reference material as possible, are two good examples. Just to provide an example, a lot of people who commission pet portraits will generally prefer the image to be as close to the photograph provided as possible. So by using tracing, they not only get closer to the final product faster, but can also focus more time into the other parts of creating the final piece, such as shading, details, and overall making the piece a lot more polished and realistic. I think one thing I would emphasize is that while I wouldn't say that tracing is the best learning method, I don't feel that it makes you any less of an artist for using it or having used it to learn in the past. While art is as much about creativity and integrity, from a business perspective you do need to consider your level of efficiency when it comes to creating artwork. Ultimately, when it comes to tracing, it's going to be based off of your perspective, as this whole discussion is somewhat subjective. When it comes to tracing and posting online, I think one should consider how others may feel about you tracing and essentially profiting off of their work. Imagine it as if your friend made an awesome piece of art and you decide to trace it and post it. So, is tracing a bad habit or a necessary tool? Well, I think that's somewhat for you guys to decide. What are your thoughts on tracing? Have you used it as a learning method, or do you feel that people should stick to freehand? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And that's about it for today's episode. If you guys like what you saw and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It supports me and is practically free. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter and DeviantArt, where I post artwork and updates about the show. This will most likely be the last video for me for this year, so I just wanted to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you all for watching, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.